every person who later develops OCD, in my mind, is a little artist, is a little poet, is a little existentialist who's misunderstood, who's feeling and thinking a lot, but doesn't necessarily know what to do with all of those feelings and thoughts.
Welcome to Wired and Worthy, the podcast for people who feel everything deeply, think about everything constantly, and have spent way too long believing that they were too much. I'm Dr. Amelia Kelley, your host, someone who believes the way you're wired was never the problem. You belong here exactly as you are. Because remember, you may be wired differently, but you are worthy always. Let's get into it. Michael, I'm trying to think of how we even stumbled upon each other now that I think about it. Did you reach out to me?
I reached out to you because I had discovered your podcast and I was thinking, oh my gosh, like it is so cool that somebody like zeroes in on the sensitivity piece. So
Yeah, I'm here for it. And as I've talked about in other episodes, like we don't even just look at the lens of sensitivity through like an HSP, but we will be talking about that today, which I'm excited about. But I also see things like how people with ADHD experience the world, trauma and sensitivity and autism. Like all of these are like sensitive life experiences. But you have tied in another diagnosis, if you will. And actually, that's probably a good place to start. The diagnosis of OCD is what we're talking about today. I would love to know how you would not define it clinically, but I guess kind of for our conversation today, how you see it and what you want people to understand before we dig in.
Yeah. So I think, when we look at OCD, we think of classic symptoms, right? So it could be checking, cleaning, counting, ruminating, ritualizing, all of these things. That's the medical way I think we view OCD, which is the disorder part. I think one of the things that when I look at OCD, I think about more the temperament and sensibility, which is a person who from the start has a heightened sense of empathy, a heightened capacity to feel and think deeply and imaginatively, and also a profound existential sensitivity, right?
Okay.
So I think that many of us start to think about the problem right out of the gate. When you say OCD, you think all of the problems. Oh my gosh, this is a person who needs constant reassurance or needs to wash their hands constantly or check things repeatedly. It's already like steps and steps and steps ahead of the person themselves. So I think we go the wrong way. I think we should start from the beginning.
Okay. So what do you think the beginning is?
So the beginning is every person who later develops OCD, in my mind, is a little artist, is a little poet, is a little existentialist who's misunderstood, who's feeling and thinking a lot, but doesn't necessarily know what to do with all of those feelings and thoughts. And I give like one kind of cool analogy that I just recently came up with in an OCD support group is that people with OCD are like actually metaphorically people who can climb really high. So if you can imagine El Capitan, they can climb that really well, but most of their lives they've had to free climb it without any support, without any belayer down below securing them. And if you were climbing El Capitan, it's a pretty extraordinary view from up there in the middle and top, even in the beginning. But if you feel alone, you start to be terrified that this isn't so great that you can notice and see all these things from this height. And I think people with OCD have the capacity to climb into this depth of feeling and thought so they can see a bigger picture. But because they're alone, it becomes terrifying. So, and later I'll use a water analogy and maybe a fire analogy. We'll get like earth, wind, earth, and all of this. But I do think there's something really interesting about starting from the strength part. Because I think we start already, even when we talk about OCD, we're already into the problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you said being alone, I wonder if we could make that feel tangible. When I think about that, when I think about the people I've worked with who have OCD, and it's interesting because it's not always the first diagnosis that seems glaringly obvious, at least to me, because sometimes they're coming with other things like sensitivity, ADHD, trauma. And it's almost like if the person has been able to engineer their life in a way where these obsessive thoughts can live in this engineered life,
Yeah.
their struggling and their suffering can seem very individual. It can seem very lonely. Like it's, unless they have the language around it, it's harder to even identify that that's happening sometimes.
Yeah, I think it's actually quite subtle, and I
Mhm.
think it's important to differentiate too. But they're so close, right? OCD is close to generalized anxiety, worrying, right? Ruminating, and thinking just like anybody else, overthinking like anybody else, which is to be human to say, right?
Right.
And it's also close to these other sensitivities, like you're saying, or even these other aspects of neurodivergence, if you will, right? And that's why, like, sometimes I think it's interesting that people tend to like overlap these things that are wildly different but seem close, like autism, right? Like autism can be similar in the way people can fixate or obsess about things, but it's extremely different because the person with autism doesn't have the same deep empathy or theory of mind that the person with OCD typically has from the start, right?
Well, and you probably saw the look on my face, only because for anyone not watching, it was a look of, huh, that's an interesting perspective. And I do see it a little bit differently though. Just because as I've been like digging into the nuance between these different sensitivities, I'm always so curious to your point, like what defines that difference. I do think it's very important for us for the conversation to identify that autism, for example, can look so dramatically different depending on the person, the
Completely.
presentation,
Completely. I think that's so important
their
too.
environment, all of that. But I've actually seen quite the opposite in some of the individuals that I work with. I tend to have, because of my specialty in ADHD, I have quite a few women that I work with who have ADHD, where they meet both criteria for autism and ADHD, and even some who do not meet criteria for ADHD. And what I actually see is this overwhelm with empathy, where
That's
some of them,
fascinating. Yeah.
yeah. So some individuals with autism, I have one client in mind I'm thinking of where it's like she's experiencing the empathy, but I'm not realizing she's experiencing the empathy because our social cues are different. So I
That's
think that
fascinating. Yeah.
yeah, so that's one facet, and then the other facet, I just wanna throw it out there, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts
Yeah,
on
I
it.
love it.
So the one facet is they may be experiencing empathy in a way that doesn't socially match with what we expect it to look like. The other is that for some individuals I work with, who are on the spectrum, on the autism spectrum, I see a lot of them as spectrums, but the autism spectrum specifically, is that the empathy is too much. It's too intense to process as another thing because their processing is so wide at all times.
Yes. So what I love about this, first of all, I love being surprised by something new that you just said. And I think it's fascinating because I'm going to play with it back and forth with you because I love it. Because
Yeah, let's do it. That's what you're here for.
I think one of the cool things that you said is that, like, maybe another part of autism that's interesting, and maybe again, it's understanding each disorder in its native tongue. And I think maybe one of the things that you're saying about autism that's really, really interesting here is that it's not that they might not feel or notice the empathy, it's that they're overwhelmed by being able to communicate in a way that is communicating to somebody else in the way that they can understand it. And I love this idea that people, let's say with OCD, like people with autism, their particular native tongue is often misunderstood and misconstrued. And the more that we can be precise about understanding their specific dialects, the better we can not only help them, but honor and respect their gifts and this fantastic way of processing and thinking and feeling. I think anytime, and I love what you did there too, Amelia, it's like, and I love, even though you had the look, which is great, you're like, Mike, I don't really agree with that. Like, I love that because this is
I'll let you know.
but I love this. We're two Long Islanders coming at it together. And I think the thing what's great about it is I think this is how we come up with really enriching the picture and really humanizing, further humanizing everybody. And I think that's about I think that's the wonderful thing about sensitivity is that it helps us keep on getting closer and closer to where, almost like a poet, where the limits of our language is and how we can help each other find new language together. And so what I love what you said about autism is, because I've also experienced with people with autism too, that they can be very, very empathic, but overwhelmed in a way by all that they're experiencing and not exactly sure how to put it into a form. And they need someone who is more adept at that to help and get practice with it. Whereas I think the person with OCD actually doesn't need practice with putting it into words. They're actually very good at putting things into words, but they have a hard time staying with ambivalent feeling. In
Oh,
other words,
yes.
strong
That I would
love,
agree with.
strong hate, and they're particularly afraid of being the one who is overly aggressive because that feels destructive, potentially problematic. It's almost like I sometimes almost see OCD on one side of the spectrum and narcissism on the other. Because a person who
Oh, like the over checking versus not checking at all.
like a person who's extremely narcissistic, let's say, God love them because they who they are and they became who they are from a variety of reasons, but they are not super empathetic and checking in. And how is this affecting everybody? They are almost too much involved with their
Interesting point.
self-interests and to the point of not caring and not having any remorse for how it affects others in its most destructive forms. Whereas people with OCD are so over scrupulous about how things are going to affect others, especially, that they don't stand for themselves and they constantly lose and doubt themselves as well.
Yeah, I would love to pause on that for a moment because now you've surprised me and given me something to think about.
Touche.
Yeah, right. So to compare, not really compare, but to contrast, I guess, the OCD scrupulosity
Mhm.
and checking with the what we call kind of lack of care or internal dialogue of a narcissist. When I think about what drives both of these,
Yeah.
is an inability to feel something.
Yes.
And so we look at the narcissist where to feel empathy,
Mhm.
we have to move through, well, an empathy, we'll say empathy for other, because I mean, I could feel empathy if you stub your toe, I might go, ooh,
Right.
that's an immediate empathy response. But I guess empathy to compassion, you have to be able to move through things like potentially shame, blame, insecurity. Like there's a lot of really complex ego assaultive type emotions that you have to quickly shift through in order to then relate back to the other person.
Responsibility as well, right? Responsibility is a
Right,
good one. You have to
exactly.
be able to take some kind of responsibility and accountability, and you have to allow yourself to be wrong, right?
And then on the OCD stance, I'd love to get your take on this because they're almost overly doing that. So what are they, in your opinion, having a hard time not feeling? You said ambiguity. Maybe you could
I
lay
said, yeah,
that out a little bit more.
ambivalence. And it's,
Ambivalence, thank you.
ambivalence is so the people with OCD tend to experience the ambivalence of, for example, I really care about this person. Like people, let's say a woman has a child and then she has OCD thoughts that she might harm or even kill her child and feels terrorized by that, understandably. But then, part of it, let's say in my hypothetical example, this woman might also not be allowing her own feelings of sometimes having a baby is a lot of work. And it means putting yourself aside constantly. And it means being super empathic and being overwhelmed. And sometimes that's frustrating. Sometimes that's makes a person feel angry, not because they don't love their child, but because it's very human. But a person with OCD will think that's not really allowed for me. That's not okay, right? My job is to be super responsible. And if I even have a whiff of starting to feel like I hate this kid, the ambivalence of I love having a child. And you know what? Sometimes I miss my sleep. I miss my own time. I miss my own body. All of these things that a woman might feel, I'm imagining myself to be a woman for a moment here, is something that the person with OCD feels a great deal of anxiety, stress, fear, conflict around. It's almost like they have a hard time being their bad selves, right?
Oh, I like that. Okay, that's a good way to put that
Right.
because I think you just identified on the one hand, we said the potential narcissist in this scenario may struggle with feeling potential personal
Yep.
negative feelings in order to relate to the other. But then the OCD person is feeling the feelings, but then feeling like the feelings are bad or wrong.
Mhm.
And so they need to check themselves with the obsessive compulsive thinking or maybe potentially a behavior.
Yes, and that's
So
why yeah.
I have a question for you. I have a client that's come to my mind
Yeah.
that I am absolutely going to be sending this episode to, who she has a pattern that travels,
Mhm.
we call it, right?
It
So
morphs, right? It goes from one thing to the other.
it morphs. Yep. And so it all stems from the fact that she had highly, highly critical parents, not shocking, to the point where a lot of our work, she's in her mid 20s, a lot of our work was around her like not continuing to go back to the emotionally deprecating, emotionally abusive father for affirmation about her life's choices, like trust yourself, or even just trust the work you do in therapy. Like you can come to me and we can process this because this is a boundaried space where you're empowered. And
Right.
so what I noticed though is that it can be whatever the thing she has the most fear around, like if it's dating, if it's should I change jobs, if it's am I in the right field, is it am I ever going to meet anyone? I mean, it kind of like just morphs and moves all over the place. How would you support? And she's also an HSP.
Makes
So
total
we've got
sense.
that.
Makes
We've
total
got
sense,
the
and I love
depth.
that about her.
Yes, we've got the depth, we've got the like deep feeling experience of the high sensitivity plus the internal check
So
in
I have
it.
an answer. You ready?
Yeah, I'm totally
So,
ready.
I mean, there's wonderful things. First of all, it's not uncommon for people with OCD to struggle with when they're around people who are too critical, too aggressive, too narcissistic. And it's not uncommon for people with OCD actually to attract people like that. Because those are the
Okay.
people that are unconsciously looking for how to do this empathy thing. But they also, and people with OCD are unconsciously looking for people who trust themselves and have certainty, right?
Oh, good point.
Right. And what I love with this particular client that you're talking about too, it's like, what's the big fear? I don't want to be, it's like, I don't want to be like that destructive, insensitive thing that I experienced too. And therefore, I don't want to take up too much space. In other words, I don't want to make a mistake or step on your toes or hurt you. So I'm going to use myself as an example because I'm just going to put myself on the couch here, right? So
Yeah, do it.
So imagine Amelia and I just had this conversation and you guys didn't see it, but she got like, oh, I could see on her face that when I said the thing about autism, she wasn't feeling it. Now, the older OCD me would have been like, oh my gosh, and be afraid. Like I was having my voice and all of a sudden I did the wrong thing and I totally hurt Amelia and possibly offended so many of the people listening. And I would start to get obsessed by all of that. Instead of realizing what we did together, Amelia, I think was like, oh, isn't this interesting? Let me be temporarily wrong and let me see how I can find my way back. And then notice my partial way of getting reassurance was to say, hey, I can see this and this. And I think this is really interesting. And then we found something together. And so at that point, I felt like then that's using the sensitivity to say, oh, Amelia, I could see where you have a new idea or a new feeling. And I can be there for you, but I'm also going to be there for me that I still have something to say. Right?
I love that.
So it's really subtle. It's really, and so I think part of the issue is in our culture, we are not trained to stay with nuance and paradox. And what I mean by
Can you
that is,
explain? Yeah, thank you.
we tend to be very either or. You're either assertive or you're a wallflower, right? You're either really, really nice and thoughtful or you're an asshole, right? Whereas it's a little bit of both all the time, right? In that moment when I was saying that stuff about OCD and autism, I was like trying to just make a point, and then I felt like, oh no, I'm the asshole. And well,
I guarantee I did not think that.
yeah, I know. Well, I'm throwing myself on the couch for everybody's sake here.
Yeah.
So imagine if I think I'm the asshole and then I feel badly about myself, then I lose where my train of connection was myself. I lose you. Then I start to go in an anxiety spiral instead of saying, actually, this is two things meeting in a creative place. And actually, as you talked about, I'm like, oh, that's fascinating. I can find a connection to that. then we can meet each other again. And you know, sort of like when Rumi said, like, in the garden, I will meet you, like, but beyond the place of right and wrong, I will meet you there. That's the place of nuance, which has complexity, where things can somewhat temporarily contradict and yet also find their home. Does that make sense?
It does. It really makes me think of the thought pattern I see in a lot of people I work with who struggle with different forms of anxiety and sensitivity is that black or white dichotomous, like all or nothing mentality, which is so the opposite of growth mindset. And what you
Completely.
were just talking about was much more like when I stumble, I can learn kind of energy,
Yes.
which feels, I would imagine, really hard or scary for someone who thinks when I'm not in control, bad things happen.
Yeah. And of course, why would they? Because sometimes when you're actually being assertive, it reminds you of those people who were assertive in a way that was too much and was not sensitive.
Mm.
And then you're like, I do not want to be that. So I wanted to also add this thing that will complicate our picture, but in a cool way, I think. I find that current treatments for OCD, God love them. I know they're extremely important to help people, and
Yeah.
they've done a lot of good for people. But here's
Mhm.
one shadow side that I just would like to focus on for a moment, just to make it nuanced, right?
And could I ask too, for the people listening, 'cause I'm so excited for this next part of the conversation.
Yeah, yeah.
Could you identify like the name and just a general scrape of the top of the barrel of what the treatments are you're going to talk about so that people know what you're
Yeah,
talking
I'm gonna.
about?
So the supposed, I'm gonna say supposed, just for my sake, the supposed gold standard of OCD treatment, the, as I'll say, evidence-based treatment for OCD is something called exposure response prevention,
Yep.
which in a nutshell is going through the thing that brings on your OCD, what triggers you, and staying through the anxiety. So exposing yourself to the anxiety. In other words, I touch the dirty thing, I expose myself to it, I stay through time with not doing the compulsive ritual of washing my hand, or if it's a thought, saying, going to the ritual to cancel the terrible thought, or checking. And that's the response prevention, which the theory and the evidence is that by learning that skill set, it helps the anxiety more naturally go down, and it helps you stop avoiding things. And the idea is that it helps you start living more, avoiding less. So
Okay.
can I critique it now? I'm going to critique it.
Yeah, 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 for
So I
sure.
will
I'd love to.
critique it from a place of nuance. And so this
Please.
is where I mean it with love, even for the field, who I love the people who work in OCD. I love the OCD community, and I love OCD specialists. Here's where I think it sends, unfortunately, the wrong message.
Okay.
In my view, ERP is basically training people who are extremely sensitive to learn how to be insensitive, to desensitize, right?
Oh, okay. That's
In other
interesting.
words, which I want you to be like the person who is not sensitive by nature. Right? No, I understand why people are like, listen, if I'm doing my rituals so many times a day, I don't want to be sensitive anymore. But I think it sends the wrong message that from the start, what if we started from the place earlier that said, wait, maybe you're sensitive, and maybe we can be with these feelings that we've been talking about, the mixed feelings of, I really, like we said about this case that you met, when it was whatever the situation was, whether a job or relationship, I want to have some room to have an exposure for the feelings I feel. Not only am I interested in this person, I'm also sometimes a little doubtful if they're the right person for me. And I have reasons to think that, or I'm not sure about the job. But maybe if we can kind of open up into the deeper feelings, and even trusting, sometimes, like I said, I think people with OCD, I'm going to use another analogy. I think with people with OCD actually have emotional perfect pitch. So a musician who has
Okay.
perfect pitch is someone who can tell this is a C, this is an A, this is an A sharp. I think they're actually really good at reading not only their own emotions, but others' emotions. In other words, they can pick up if someone's feeling something, even if they're not saying it, right?
I definitely would agree with that with HSPs. With OCD, I find that interesting because when sometimes I compare it to kind of like letting someone rent a space in your, like
Yeah.
a rent-free room in your head, where if we don't involve the other person and we just continue having the conversation internally, we can use our own biases, our own filters, we can alter things. So I don't disagree, but I'm so intrigued by your perspective on that because again, I'm like,
How does that
Okay.
fit? So I'll
Yeah.
come back to that in a moment too, because that also has to do with our next topic, which is boundaries, psychological boundaries in OCD. But coming back
Mhm.
to the exposure response prevention, I think it's actually more helpful to help people dig into their nuanced feelings about situations and to actually look at the context of, what was going on for you when this OCD spike happened? Or what were some of the
Mhm.
things way before
Mhm.
let's even look at when you first started to get OCD symptoms. Let's look closer there. There's a fuller
Mhm.
story that I think needs to be told in a more sensitive and complex way.
Yeah, I could almost see taking, parts work like internal family
All
systems where you
internal family
pull.
systems work is beautiful for it.
Yeah, I almost feel like I do see some neurological benefit to the exposure. I've seen it work. I've
Sure.
seen it be really powerful. I had this really interesting session with a client who was afraid of spiders, and she just happened to be at her family cabin for a virtual session within state lines, guys. So it was legal. And I just suddenly was like, "Wait, you're afraid of spiders, aren't you?" We did like a whole ERP session where she sat outside with the spiders, and it was like a whole thing, and it worked really well for her. So, like from a nervous system standpoint, sometimes when we start to, it reminds me of when you're in like an airplane, and at first we hear the engines kick on,
Totally.
and then your
Yeah.
nervous system acclimates. So I see the benefit, but I could see how if someone is deeply processing in addition to that, how it would just feel like torture.
Right.
And it would also maybe like to your point, I'm hearing you say like kind of diminish their gifts of deep feeling and processing. So
Yeah.
what you're saying is making me think of marrying the curiosity of parts work with the experience of something like
It's
ERP. Is
exactly it.
that
It's exactly it.
okay?
Actually, what's beautiful about what you said, Amelia, and this is exactly where I think our field needs to move. It's more integrated because you were precisely right. That exposure is fantastic. We do exposure in every therapy. And exposure that's just behavioral is good, but exposure that's also emotional, like parts work or even psychodynamic work, is exactly what we all do. What do we do? But we stumble on things that become scary emotionally and intellectually and behaviorally. And the job of all therapists is to make it not only more safe, but more interesting and more playful again. And so I think we limit the scope by just saying we're going to just expose with the behavior
And just deal with
and
it.
just deal with it. And that's the other thing is because I actually think people often, if you ask them to tell the fuller story, they will know. I remember I had this dream when I was a kid. One person that I interviewed for the book who lovely shared her story. She's an artist. She said, when I was a kid, I was aware that one night I woke up and I was sleepwalking. And from that moment, I started to be afraid. What if I started sleepwalking and I had scissors and I hurt my family? And part of it was she was being aware, like, how scary it is to have things that are not fully under our conscious control and what can happen. And then she thought, well, what could happen if something harmful could happen, which is an early awareness of death, right? And interestingly, now she's an artist, and in her artwork, she has scissors in her artwork to showcase that she's not only no longer afraid of them, but there's something actually sharp and cutting in a way of being an artist that she incorporates, which is so much more nuanced. And so now no longer is it a behavioral thing. I'm going to expose myself to literal scissors. It's metaphorical and emotional. So what I love about what you said too, Amelia, it's like marrying what's the best of what we do in all therapies. And
Right,
the
right.
reason that I'm so passionate about it, and by the way, speaking to anybody out there who has OCD, I want you to see how that what's out there addresses it, but I also want to see how you've been slightly misunderstood in full. Because I think at best it feels being misunderstood. At worst, I think it feels like being gaslit. In other words, that the way in which you are is wrong from the start, right? In other words, be more like others, which is not sensitive. In the way that I look at this stuff, I actually want to lean into how we can bring that sensitivity into dialogue like we did. Now, of course, once we make it into dialogue, so by the way, that's what poets do. Poets take, Robert Frost said something really interesting about poetry. He said, poetry is a momentary stay against confusion.
Oh, I like that. That's
Poetry
beautiful.
helps us to actually play with the disordered mix of life and find order in it and be with the nuance and give it form. I think for me, what's missing in OCD treatment is a lack of poetry and a lack of heart. Because when we don't focus enough on this place, we miss the feelings, which is the heart, and we miss this imagination, which is the poetry.
Yeah. Well, I think also if we were going to pull in the sensitivity piece, kind of highlight it a little bit too, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about some of the needs of HSPs where they sometimes get misdiagnosed or misunderstood for being obsessive compulsive.
Right.
Like a personal share, my paternal grandmother, it's so funny. I remember going, and we were talking about Long Island. I remember going to her, like, you know how they have those trailers like down, what is it? What is that route? I'm trying to remember the route that goes through the whole entire island.
Oh, Route 110 or?
Yes.
There
It was
you go.
right off 110. Thank you. And like they have those trailers that are like houses,
Yes.
right? And I remember going in, and from the outside it was just kind of like a box, and you go in and it was just this whole environment and this whole world, and everything was so beautiful. And like I remember the place that everything was, because now I can reflect, she absolutely was an HSP, but family lore leading up to the point where I learned what an HSP was that she was kind of identified as being OCD. But when I look back as a clinician, she didn't meet any of the criteria. She was absolutely HSP through and through.
Yeah.
Liked things so, because when they were so, it helps her nervous system. This is also something that shows up in ADHD, where if things are not where they are, you don't know where the heck they are. So I think there's a lot of overuse and misunderstanding about just obsessive compulsive thoughts or ruminations.
I think so too. And I think that's a really good distinction.
Yeah.
I think what's really wonderful, here's maybe the stats will help us. I'm usually more a story guy, but I'll use the stats to help with this. So what is it, like 15 to 20% of the American population are highly sensitive, I've once read?
Yeah, it ranges anywhere from 15 to 20 on some studies. I've seen as high as 30, but it also, if you probably know this, I don't know, but it also accounts for all animal species.
That's fascinating. And that makes
Even
sense.
bugs.
But
Even bugs.
Which makes sense. And that's where I also think is really important. So let's just say anywhere from 15 to 30% are highly sensitive. I would group people with OCD in that same category. I would say there was a smaller category, which is in America, 1 to 2% of the American population have OCD. Right. So if you can imagine, when people would easily group, that relative of yours, right? Was it your grandmother?
Yes.
Right. Into, oh my gosh, she's OCD. Is that, oh my gosh, she's in this 15 to 30%. And you're right, 1%, but it's not really as precise for her. But it has overlap because there is such a big core, I think, of OCD is sensitivity. And in fact, when I'm working with clients who are not OCD, but they're highly sensitive, I'm very much doing similar kind of work, believe it or not. So I think that's the good news. I do think that kind of precision, just like we were talking about the precision with autism and ADHD, I think that helps us to really know the full person on every level. And again, I think, like you, I'm sure you think this is a combination of nature and nurture. But some part of it, I think that we've forgotten, is the important part of nature in all of this. And I think that's where I will throw it out there myself. I didn't realize, I knew throughout my life, my mom had pretty severe OCD cleaning type, right? And doubting of certain kinds of things, mostly cleaning, sometimes checking, and we were endearing about it. We would we were used to having, my mom would bring tissues with rubbing alcohol, and we would have to wipe our hands after going, or she would hold the door with
She would have been great during COVID.
I know. We totally was like, oh my gosh, this is like going back home. This is great. We're all in this together. It's fantastic. But the thing is, she also, as you imagine, what I loved about my mom is that the sensitivity was where it all came from. She was extremely sensitive. She was a therapist too. She was always, even when we in Long Island, when we were at a diner, she could tell which couple was about to have the fight and why. She could tell the change in tone from a few tables away. When we'd go to movies, we wouldn't talk. I had a friend, we went to a movie and we wanted to go like an Arnold Schwarzenegger action movie. But my mom took us to a movie called Avalon, which was like a family coming of age story of immigrants. And we talked about all the different nuances of it. That was what we did. And because I had this wonderful relationship to share the nuance, it helped me see that sensitivity is wonderful. And I think there's not enough, I think more and more as a society, we're getting better with, Elaine Aron putting HSPs on the radar, Susan Cain talking about introverts who are also highly sensitive, I think, by nature. And all this stuff that you're talking about with all these people, including OCD, autism, ADHD, all this stuff. I think it's helping to give more language to the wide and rich variety of what it is to be sensitive. And I think what the cool thing, like you said, even with your grandmother, even if she didn't have OCD, she had the thing that was so important to being sensitive. And people with OCD,
Which is what?
well, it's noticing.
Oh, noticing.
Yeah,
Okay,
so
yeah.
I call those of us with sensitivity nuance noticers and feeling noticers, right? Where we notice feeling, and we're also many times there's an intuitive connection to that, right? Because feelings are largely intuitive in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that can be a wonderful gift, and it can feel like a wonderful, a heartbreaking burden at times.
I want to ask you actually, almost like I'm formulating this creative thought based on what I've read about the correlation and overlap between HSPs and OCD, lived experience, and just your opinion. Do you think it would be fair to say that not everyone with OCD is an HSP, but probably everyone who is an HSP has more potential, not that they all have OCD, but more potentiality because of the way that they absorb the world, because of the way that they may need to protect their nervous system, because of their deep feeling, may have a bit more potentiality
Mm-hmm.
to become OCD? This is not a prognosis.
I
It's
love
just,
it.
I'm
So
curious
I
your
will
thoughts.
say yes and no, but I'll go first with the yes because I'm an
Okay.
improv kind of guy, right? So let's
Okay.
yes and it. So the yes and part is I agree that I think people who are HSPs, after a while of getting overstimulated, people with high sensitivity need to find form, right? We all need to find form. We all need to have those momentary stays against confusion. And one way that we will try to do that is to make order, and we will obsess and over make order. So it's easy for a person with who's an HSP in general to become obsessional from that place.
Especially if they're raised in, because you've probably heard that orchid versus dandelion,
Yes.
where they see
Depending
the
on what
HSP.
kind of environment you're raised in, are
Yes,
they
yes.
sensitive to the orchid, or are they thinking you must be a dandelion like us, and so we're not
Mhm.
going to be sensitive, and so we're going to make you feel like there's something wrong with you, or we're going to make you feel like your needs are strange.
Yes. Mhm.
Yeah.
Well put.
And
Mhm.
on the other side, so here's where I try a different way of looking at this other part with the OCD. I mean, and this is the jury's out on this. I'd be curious to what others think of this too. I actually think that people with OCD are definitely HSPs. See,
Ah,
I've
okay.
never met a true OCD person that was not an HSP.
I'm not necessarily disagreeing. It's a new thought I've not thought
But you
of
know what I would,
before.
you know where I would, actually, you know where I contrast it? Actually, this might be interesting. Right about this one? I
Mm.
think maybe this is why. I think sometimes when people look at OCD, they unconsciously group in obsessive compulsive personality disorder.
Yeah, I could see that.
And so
Mhm.
so for those listening, the
Yes, thank
personality
you. Please
disorder
define
is,
that.
let's say, somebody who feels like, you know what, my house needs to be ordered in just this way. And
Mhm.
and that's the right way. And if you don't do that, I kind of feel like, what's wrong with you? I'm a little bit superior because I do it the right way.
Well, and
That
there's a lot of stress over people not doing it the
right.
quote right way with you.
Right.
Mhm.
So that was like long ago when Jack Nicholson was in the role of As Good as It Gets. I remember thinking he's not really OCD. He's really the personality disorder. His whole MO was more the personality disorder. So the reason, the big clinical term for it is that it's egosyntonic for them. They really do not want to change that. They don't think there's anything to change. They think the world should change to conform to them. Whereas people with OCD do not like the fact that they have to wash their hands. They think, I shouldn't want to do this. I shouldn't need to do this. In fact, my mom used to apologize profusely. I'm sorry, I am making you wash your hands. So for people who have OCD proper, I think that's highly sensitive. For people who have the personality disorder, I do not think they have the HSP thing.
I agree with that. I mean, I could see that in the sense that the insecurity piece that's connected to OCPD
Mhm.
isn't always necessarily connected to just like a highly sensitive person. It
Right.
really depends on what their experience was. What you're saying, though, is making me think of something that earlier in our conversation I wanted to ask you, and I think this would be a great time.
Yeah.
You talked about having the right language
Mhm.
around supporting someone with OCD tendencies and OCPD potentially. I'm thinking of even just as a therapist sometimes,
Mhm.
just to be completely plainly clear, the exhaustion that it can cause to be the reassurer
Ah, yes.
all the
The big
time.
reassurance issue. Yes, it's a good one.
Yeah. I'm so curious your thoughts on that because I think it plays into what you were saying about having the right language around this to support people who maybe have obsessive thoughts because they're highly sensitive and they're trying to master the environment, or maybe because they have, however you put it, like true OCD or something
Yes.
like that.
So there's big, there's such a big there's such a big issue around reassurance in the general community and OCD community because it's the big fear, like you're not supposed to do that, right? That just makes it worse. And then of course it can become exhausting and almost, dare we say, exasperating for someone to continually ask you. The way I like to think about it is that this is coming from the place of fear of not being able to be with the feelings in a way that actually makes it feel like there's something solid and coherent. So I use the term assurance. I think people deserve to have assurance that they might have good reasons that their OCD is spiking right now or being triggered right now.
Oh, I love that. So you don't have to necessarily say, no, the bad thing won't happen. It can be more, oh, I can see why your OCD thoughts are
I can
coming.
see right now why your OCD is
Oh, that's
triggering
so
you,
good. I
and
love
you're
that.
starting to worry about maybe I'm potentially gay, which is like a one OCD theme, or
Mhm.
maybe I could have harmed somebody as I was driving home, right? Well, I want to like actually let's and again, here's for the people who like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, right? You could say this is basically just exposure response prevention, but from an emotional place. Let's look at some of the feelings you were having right around the time this thing started to hit you. When you were driving home, what did you notice? Were you feeling a little tired and a little frustrated that traffic was getting a little bit, strong? Were you feeling like it was such an annoying day that you just didn't care about having to wait for the pedestrian crossing in front of you? Were you starting to feel a sense of anger and then you felt like that wasn't right? And then did you notice that all of a sudden you started to worry that maybe I actually ran over that person? In other words, let's get into the fuller nuanced story. And I want to provide assurance that there's some coherent thing that's happening here. See, that's the thing where I disagree with OCD specialists in the main, is that they get really, really like really concerned if you're giving any meaning to OCD whatsoever. And I actually think that we are all looking for meaning and coherence. And I don't think it's different with OCD. I think when we get underneath the anxiety, when we get actually to the sensitivity, it's almost like listening to a dream. There's a great Talmudic expression: an uninterpreted dream is like an unread letter from God,
Wow.
right?
Deep.
Yeah. And so I think when we don't actually metaphorically read OCD symptoms, we're not reading that letter.
So I'm thinking of a client that I used to work with who did lots of checking
Mhm.
in therapy, lots and lots and lots of checking to the point where I had to have her journal in between sessions. She would start our session with like a 5-minute dump to get
Mm.
it all out
Mhm.
because otherwise the whole entire session was checking, 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 checking. And I really cared about her and I didn't want to get burnt out, to
Right.
be completely honest. That's
Totally.
kind of why we framed it that way. I could see there were moments where I tried to lean into that a bit and it almost caused, and maybe this is something to just like stay with and maybe do like parts curiosity around it.
Yeah.
it angered her. Like, it was almost like, no, like, stop asking me more questions. Just make me feel better.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think because, when a person is
She wasn't that aggressive, but
no,
it
but
was
of
more
course,
the
but I
energy.
think again, so if you wanna look at it as metaphorically, when we're in
Mhm.
too many feelings that are overwhelming, it's like we're in water and we feel like we're drowning. And a natural response when we're drowning is to be aggressive, like, "Get me out of this." I wanna help people see that actually, you know, you're very aware of the depths of the water. That's the other metaphor that I'm gonna use for OCD. People with OCD are used to being in very deep water and very, constantly changing waters. And they've often been with people who haven't really been in that and then don't understand why they can't just get out of it. But when you're caught in the undertow or very deep waters, it's terrifying. And I think helping people, first of all, they do need to be rescued initially to get out first. And then to say, now that we're safer, let's talk about what it was like and what was going on. Right.
Okay, so like a little reassurance to get them out of the water and then some assurance and
Yes.
some exploration. I li I appreciate that because people who are listening who maybe aren't even clinicians could also think to themselves, like, what do I need to do for myself even if I catch myself in a thought loop or something that I kinda can't swim out of, so to speak.
Well, and it's weird because I mean, the other thing too is I think that's when we kind of say, hey, I'm going to flail with you. I'm going to hold you and I'm going to flail with you. See, that's the nuanced perspective. That's what the poet does. The poet says, I'm going to recognize this disorder, but I'm going to find a way to make order to it. And we are going to do this together so you don't have to be scared. It's like I was a kid who was terrified of swimming, right? But I remember when I had a teacher who I knew was sensitive and kind to show me that she was going to be there when I jumped in the deep end with a life preserver on. And if I needed her, she would jump in. And she wasn't going to shame me if I needed steps with that. That makes the difference. So I think, remember, people with OCD have hardly ever, and by the way, even now, I still think that people are not given the proper assurance that this deep feeling is not strange. It's not strange at all, and it is scary and it is terrifying, but it's also wonderful when you have somebody who can reflect it back and say, "You know what? I think you've been feeling this and feeling that and feeling that. And now that we name it, can't you float on it now? Let's float on it
I
together."
love that.
Right?
Yeah, and so anyone who heard you today and just really related to you, and you mentioned a book and you do lots of other work around this, um, where could they continue floating with you?
Oh my gosh, right? So, I mean, obviously, I've written this kind of almost part treatment manual, part manifesto for those of us with OCD tendencies called the Upside of OCD. And I have a little website for that, michael-alcee.com, where you can find more information about the book. And, I do individual therapy on this, but I also love doing OCD support groups,
Oh, yeah,
which
I
is
could see
really
that.
fun. And what's so cool is I've had people from all over the world, from like Canada, Australia, Ireland. I think we need to have more of a relational community when it comes to OCD. I think we no longer need to feel like we're free climbing. I think we no longer need to feel like we're in the water
Mhm,
alone. I think that's the assurance that you're talking about, Amelia. And I want to give you kudos because it's hard to not feel exasperated or overwhelmed because
mhm,
nobody talks about these waters.
mm,
And I
mhm.
think talking about sensitivity is talking about those waters. Every which way we talk about sensitivity is talking about those waters.
Yes. Awesome. Well, anyone who wants to get support, please reach out to Michael. I love the idea of you doing groups. I'm a strong proponent. It's like seeing others see you makes all the difference. So, thank you again for bringing us a brand new perspective on something that I think a lot of sensitive people may not even know that they were experiencing, but now they have some language around it. So, thank you so much for everyone being here. Please share this episode with someone that's on your heart who maybe could relate to this as well, or maybe you want someone else to understand you. So thank you again and be well, everyone.